Wish your life was a little simpler? Yearning for the good old days of yore? Then the Middle Ages are for you.
Come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
Warning, Middle Ages not guaranteed to be for you. May cause plagues, storms, wars, Mongols, Vikings, or dysentery. Always consult a historian before operating your time machine. Okay, first things first. Although you've probably heard of Viking people, the term isn't actually the name of an ethnic group. It's more of a job title, albeit a job that involves pillaging your way across the medieval world. For around 300 years, great ships filled with intrepid Norsemen would turn up all around Europe, burning, pillaging, stealing, the R-wording, and enslaving nearly everyone they could get their hands on, and killing anyone who resisted. It's widely accepted that the Viking Age began with the sack of the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 AD. For a while, the Vikings were content to just do the burning and pillaging, and they especially liked to target wealthy, undefended Christian communities like monasteries and churches.
If this is our God, and he's dead, he's nailed to a cross.
Before long, though, they realized that these wealthy, fertile places beyond the sea might actually be worth staying in. They settled in Britain, Ireland, France, and the Baltic coast. Some ventured as far as Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. The threat of the Northmen wasn't to last forever, though, and the end of the Vikings began in 1066, when the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada was killed during a failed invasion of England. After that, the fortunes of the Vikings never really recovered. Say it with me now. Obviously, invasions are never fun for the people fighting them off, but Mongol invasions? That's a whole nother ballgame. After uniting the Mongol tribes in 1206, Genghis Khan decided to try and fight basically everyone he could reach, which, given the Mongols' skill on horseback, was a fairly reasonable distance. By the time of his death 21 years later, the Mongols had rolled across China, Korea, Persia, and the Caspian Sea. Genghis' son, Ogedei, then took the war to Europe in 1237, capturing Kiev, Krakow, and Budapest, and almost reaching Vienna. Fortunately for everyone else, Ogedei's death in 1241 drew his heirs' attention from Europe, though they would continue to occupy much of Russia for many generations to come. Armed with powerful bows and some of the finest horses in the world, the Mongols were a nearly unstoppable force of devastation. Defiant cities might be sacked so brutally that even their irrigation systems were destroyed, and the few people left alive were often sent on to tell their neighbors of the horrors they'd seen. This was a shrewd move on the Mongols' part. Before long, their reputation was doing their job for them. Nothing like a solid pillaging to do the PR work for you. Living in the Middle Ages, it was never a good idea to stand out from the crowd, especially when it came to religion. But conforming didn't necessarily keep you safe either. If you lived near people with unusual religious beliefs, or even just in a place coveted by a Christian ruler, you could find yourself the target of a crusade. The largest and deadliest crusades were those waged by Europe's monarchies in an attempt to conquer the Holy Land.
You go to certain death.
All death is certain.
But they weren't the only ones. For example, the tribes who lived around the Baltic Sea faced crusades in the 12th and 13th centuries after taking too long to Christianize. Meanwhile, Christian and Muslim forces fought intermittently over southern Iberia for nearly 800 years, until the Muslim capital of Granada finally fell in 1492. Crusades could even be launched inside Christian kingdoms. The Cathars of southern France practiced a supposedly heretical form of egalitarian Christianity, which gave the French crown the perfect excuse to rustle up an army and invade. The Cathars and their neighbors were ground down over 20 years of warfare before finally being crushed by the Crusaders. That said, they did get one last shot in before the end, when the Crusader general Simon de Montfort's head was smashed by a rock launched from a catapult, so it wasn't all bad. Chevauchée. Sounds fancy, even sophisticated. Not really. Turns out it's the ultimate brutality. Chevauchée was a particularly savage form of scorched earth warfare in which a relatively small force ran riot across the land, burning and killing as they went. And all that carnage was exactly the point. By laying waste to your enemies' farms and villages, you damage their economic well-being and demoralize the peasants who serve them. In some rare cases, you might even tempt enemy knights to defect. Chevauchée is most closely associated with the conduct of English forces during the early phases of the Hundred Years' War, when Edward III and his men cut bloody zigzags across France. Instead of engaging in pitched battles, Edward's army wore down the French with raids on their lands and people, and they continued to do so right up until the end of the 14th century, at which point the English turned their focus to another kind of warfare. Siege warfare dominated the medieval era. If they had the men, the supplies, and the time, any invading army could simply surround a city or castle they wanted and just wait for hunger and thirst to force the defenders to surrender. If they were in more of a hurry, they might use any number of innovative weapons or tactics in order to force a speedy and violent resolution to the siege. The defenders weren't necessarily helpless. Dropping oil on wall crawlers was mighty effective, and they could always harass the enemy from inside their walls, or even sally forth to attack them, Rohirrim style. Under the unwritten rules of the chivalric code, medieval sieges would often begin with an early offer for the city to surrender, in which case the defenders would likely be spared. If they refused, they could expect no mercy, and successful sieges often ended with looting, violence, arson, and all kinds of other atrocities. This was not only considered a kind of reward for the soldiers on the winning side, but also served the strategic purpose of making the attacker's reputation more fearsome, in the hopes that their next target would surrender without a fight. The Black Death tends to get a lot of bad press, despite the on-point name. The black came from the internal bleeding that would darken the skin, and the death came from, the death. Considering it very nearly wiped out the whole of Europe, at least they got the name right. But it was far from the only killer bug to cause problems in the medieval era. Take smallpox, for example. This horrific disease appears to have been plaguing humanity as far back as ancient Egypt, judging from the pox-like blemishes we found on some mummies. Meanwhile, written descriptions matching the disease appear in records from pre-modern China and India. Infection occurred from close contact with a sick or infected person, and the first stage of the disease would manifest as a serious bout of flu-like symptoms, as the virus replicated within the immune tissues. A few days later, a telltale rash would appear, which could either be barely noticeable or so severe that the lesions ran together in large patches of inflammation. Children were especially likely to die if infected, and survivors often bore severe disfiguring scars. In short, smallpox really wasn't much fun. What does it take to kill a king? In the Middle Ages, not a lot.
You have selected Regicide. If you know the name of the king or queen being murdered, press 1.
While campaigning in France at the end of the 12th century, Richard the Lionheart was struck by a crossbow bolt. That bolt didn't directly kill him, though. In fact, it only got him in the shoulder, but the wound became infected. Just a few days later, the king died, stinking and feverish in his mother's arms. Before the discovery of antibiotics, bacterial infections meant that even small injuries or wounds could prove fatal. Many of these infections led to gangrene. This can flood the body with bacteria that grew unchecked in the dead flesh. It's not an easy condition to fight. Even nowadays, the best remedy we have for gangrene is the removal of the affected tissue. Untreated infections could also lead to sepsis. This dangerous condition occurs basically when the immune response overreacts and begins to damage the body itself, which is not good. Sepsis is still considered a medical emergency today, as patients face a high mortality rate even in well-equipped medical settings. Diarrhea, mankind's greatest leveler. Few conditions pose a greater risk to life in places without effective sanitation, and this was absolutely a concern for pretty much everyone in the Middle Ages. Even in the modern world, diarrhea kills nearly 500,000 children annually, along with any number of vulnerable, immunocompromised, or simply unlucky adults. And most dangerous of all is the star of the Oregon Trail, dysentery. Do you know the definition of dysentery? Are you sitting down? It is defined by the World Health Organization as diarrhea that's severe enough to contain visible blood. Oh, you don't have one for that? Good. So, the most common cause of death for people suffering from dysentery is dehydration, as critical fluid loss leaves the body without enough internal water to complete its basic functions. Unfortunately, diarrhea can also be passed around very easily. People who lack basic hygiene can contaminate food or water supplies with trace amounts of infected waste, passing dangerous bacteria to others in the process. In the pre-germ theory, pre-flush toilet world of the Middle Ages, diarrheal disease could kill even the rich and powerful. England had at least 3 kings who died of dysentery: John, Edward I, and Henry V. All 3 were traveling with their armies when they fell ill, and despite being actual literal kings, none of them had sufficient access to clean food, water, or sanitation. With no warning system in place beyond actually looking at the sky, pre-modern people were pretty much vulnerable to erratic weather conditions, and partly cloudy could turn to mostly deadly in an instant. The low-lying territories of the modern Netherlands were subject to some truly devastating floods during the medieval period. On December 14, 1287, a storm surge struck when the tide was already high, smashing the Dutch and German coasts so badly that formerly inland cities became ports, and lakes became bays of the North Sea. This flood may have killed 50,000 people in the most severely affected areas, with some deaths occurring even in eastern England. The region faced floods of a similar intensity in 1953, but this time only around 2,000 people were killed. Thanks to modern weather forecasting, the authorities were able to order a series of evacuations, likely saving countless lives. It's crazy what we take for granted, isn't it? By the mid-1300s, the warm conditions that had dominated most of the Middle Ages in Europe had given way to the relative chill of the so-called Little Ice Age. Florence was covered in snow for all of February 1352, and in the winter of 1363-64, the Rhine froze solid for weeks, as did the lagoon around Venice. Medieval people prepared for the cold by killing animals to preserve their meat and sowing winter crops that would hopefully pop up with the first green shoots of the spring. Peasants had a particularly hard time, of course, being peasants and all. Glass windows were too expensive, so they had to use paper to cover the openings in their homes. Fires helped, sure, but open flames and smoke carry their own risks. The poor also dressed in as many layers as they could stand or afford, but even that was sometimes not enough. In the harsh winters of the Middle Ages, people might freeze, starve, or succumb to the combined effects of cold and hunger. Additionally, heavy snowfalls could collapse the roof of a modest home, burying the inhabitants under snow and debris. And let's be honest, anyone would rightly be ticked off if they managed to survive crusades, sieges, Vikings, Mongols, and diarrhea before meeting their doom because some snow made their roof fall in. But hey, that's life in the Middle Ages for you.
Grief is awful no matter what form it takes, but the passing of a child can be an unspeakably tragic turn of events. Luckily, we in the West are far less likely to experience this. In America, infant mortality is only around 0.006%, and that rate drops once kids leave infancy. Mortality for children between the ages of 1 and 4 is around 0.0002%, and for kids aged 5 to 14, it's around 0.0001%. Now compare that to childhood mortality in the Middle Ages. According to Representing Childhood, exact figures are impossible to come by, but estimates place the medieval infant mortality at around 25%. That means 1 out of every 4 babies born during that time period wouldn't make it past their first year of life. The odds went up a bit for children who made it to toddlerhood. Kids between the ages of 1 and 4 had a mortality rate of around 12.5%. If they made it to 5, then things looked better, as the mortality rate for kids between the ages of 5 and 9 was only about 6%. Still, that was far worse than even the highest mortality rate for infants in modern America. The sad truth is that being born in the Middle Ages didn't guarantee you a life, not by a long shot. Luckily for us, bubonic plague isn't such a problem nowadays. It does still exist. In fact, 20,000 people came down with it between 2000 and 2009, including 56 in the United States, but it certainly doesn't exist on the scale that it did in the Middle Ages. In fact, were you to travel back in time to 1340s Europe, when the outbreak known as the Black Death was ongoing, your chances of survival would be somewhere between 7 in 10 and 2 in 5.
I'm not dead. What? Nothing. Here's your ninepence. I'm not dead.
Here, he says he's not dead.
Yes, he is. I'm not.
Estimates suggest that the Black Death killed as much as 60% of the entire population of Europe, meaning that 3 out of every 5 people you met were going to be dead by the end of the pandemic, which peaked over the course of just 4 years. But the craziest part of all this is what happened after the outbreak died down. Since around half the known world had died off, the balance of power in Europe underwent a radical shift. Suddenly, peasants could ask for pay raises and demand improvements in working conditions, and in many ways, life actually got better for them. And all it took was the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. Everyone in medieval Europe was a good Catholic, except for those who weren't, and they either had to make pretend or die for their beliefs. And that's because the religious freedoms enjoyed today were most definitely not a thing. During the 11th and 12th centuries, for example, people started thinking critically about the Catholic Church, and one of the things that some of those people disliked most about the Church was its vast wealth and power. Unfortunately, these were dangerous times, and the Church was so wealthy and powerful that it could snuff out pretty much anyone who criticized it. In the name of God, obviously. No one is really sure how many people were burned during that time period, but what is known is that it was sometimes done in groups of 200 or more, and this didn't end for a long time either. Queen Mary of England burned 300 Protestants over the course of the 1550s. Women had it especially hard during the Middle Ages. They were generally regarded as morally weak and weren't allowed to do things that modern women take for granted, such as getting a job, deciding who to marry, or generally having opinions about things. There were some powerful women, granted, but they were pretty uncommon. The worst part about being a woman, though, was that you were expected to procreate or else become a nun. And you wouldn't have been too mad to have taken that second option, considering the intense dangers of childbirth, which would kill like 1 out of every 3 women. In fact, childbirth in the Middle Ages and the Tudor period was so dangerous that women were encouraged to write out a last will and testament well in advance of giving birth, which kind of puts a damper on the whole thing. Popular culture based around the medieval period tends to focus around the higher echelons of society, kings, queens, nobles, and other aristocrats, for example. But those people only made up a small fraction of society. Peasants, on the other hand, comprised around 90% of the population, meaning the chances were good you'd be slinging mud with the rest of them.
Bloody peasant! Oh, what a giveaway. Did you hear that? Did you hear that, eh?
The problem with becoming a peasant, unfortunately, is that the life of a peasant pretty much sucked. Peasants wore the same rough, itchy wool outfit every day, ate bread, porridge, and vegetables, and if they were lucky, got a little bit of meat every now and again. On top of that, whenever the weather sucked, they died. Peasants would starve when the weather was too wet, and they would starve when the weather was too dry, because when the crops failed, so did they. The average life expectancy for a peasant in medieval Europe was between 25 and 30 years old. If you wanted to travel in the Middle Ages, the local monastery usually offered a clean, safe place to sleep. But what if there was no local monastery? Well, in that case, you might be able to stop at an inn. Conditions in most inns weren't exactly perfect, but they were usually a safe enough place to spend the night. Depending on where you were going, however, you weren't always going to have the option of staying in an inn. And that might mean sleeping out in the open, which was a really terrible idea. There were always unsavory characters lurking on the roads after dark, and wild animals were a serious problem too. People embarking on pilgrimages during the Middle Ages often traveled in groups for safety, and wealthy people would sometimes just pay someone to go on pilgrimage for them. That may seem kinda like it defeats the point, sure, but it's gotta be better than risking it out on the road. Many of history's wars have been fought for pretty silly reasons, and the Middle Ages were no different. Many of them, of course, were fought to decide which aristocrat or royal was going to end up sitting on the throne. But even though these were faraway disputes contested between people you'd probably never even seen before, you'd still be the one dying for them. It wasn't all bad, though. In many cases, if you weren't killed within the first 40 days, you could go back home to your family. That's because it was bad business to draft all the peasants into service at the same time. With no one around to take care of the farms, the kingdom would lose money, and then it wouldn't be able to afford the war in the first place. Noblemen died in war too, of course. Before 1550, roughly 30% of them could expect to perish in some battle or another. But as for the peasants, well, no one really knows because peasant deaths were considered so inconsequential that no one ever actually counted them. It didn't help that defeat in battle often meant the systematic slaughter of the losing side, which would have been mostly made up of commoners. Not a good time to be a peasant or a soldier, that's for sure, and most of the time being one meant being the other. In the UK today, there are no capital crimes at all because they abolished the death penalty back in 1965. But long before that, medieval England was really big on executing people. During the Middle Ages, there were 50 capital crimes on the books, which included not just treason and various forms of murder, but lesser things like poaching, robbery, and forgery. Weirdly, however, this is one of those rare instances where you'd actually be better off in the Middle Ages than you would be a little later on in history. Sure, there are no capital crimes in the UK today, but by the 1600s, the number of crimes you could be officially executed for rose to around 200, and included things like petty theft, damaging Westminster Bridge, and cutting down a sapling. Although it's worth pointing out that the so-called Bloody Code of that time period actually resulted in fewer executions, probably because juries were reluctant to sentence people to death for such minor offenses. Still, you wouldn't want to risk it, would you? Most medieval people may have been illiterate, but that doesn't mean they were stupid. Everything you've heard about how people in the Middle Ages covered the taste of rotten meat with heavy spices isn't actually true. Spices were expensive, and anyone who could afford them could also afford to throw out any meat that had gone bad. In fact, for the most part, people knew how to preserve food. They salted, smoked, dried, and pickled it, and there doesn't seem to have ever been a rash of people dying because they were eating bad meat. There were other dangers lurking in the food, though. If you were rich, you probably owned a nice set of fancy glazed dishes which were full of lead and other heavy metals like mercury. But when you filled your plates and bowls up with salty or acidic foods, the glaze would start to break down and those metals would leach into your food. So members of the upper class were slowly poisoning themselves as they dined on their luxury dishware. Meanwhile, bakers sometimes made bread from rye infected with a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, and that could cause an outbreak of an illness that modern medicine knows as ergotism. The infection caused hallucinations, convulsions, a burning sensation in the limbs, and sometimes even blackened body parts that would eventually just fall off. Every meal was a gamble. Getting sick during the Middle Ages was even more of a nightmare than it is today. There were no antibiotics, no chemotherapy, and physicians didn't wash their hands in between patients. The things doctors did know were mostly wrong and almost always totally useless from a medical perspective. A sick person could be diagnosed with the help of an astrological chart, for example, and treatment might include bloodletting, purging, or trepanning, which was the practice of drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure in the brain. Unsurprisingly, these treatments not only rarely worked, but sometimes even hastened a patient's death. Still, the practice of bloodletting persisted for a long time. In fact, there's still debate on whether George Washington was killed by strep throat or by the aggressive bloodletting doctors used to treat the condition. If you somehow managed to escape all those other dangers, you'd still be left with one very harsh truth. The medieval period was very, very violent. In fact, according to History Extra, murder in medieval England was around 10 times more common than it is today. And there's a reason the men had it so much worse than the women. Life expectancy for women in the Middle Ages was actually considerably better than it was for men, despite the fact that they frequently ran the risk of dying in childbirth. On average, a woman could expect to live about 9.4 years longer than her male counterparts, and that was mostly because of the constant violence that existed between men. Roughly 46% of all deaths in men ages 15 and above were caused by violence, so a man living in medieval England had a roughly 1 in 2 chance of meeting a bloody end. All in all, those really aren't great odds.